Hits Hankey on the under. Kyle Hankey looking down the field. Gets it
Chambers
swung back to Radak. Up in the air. Looking for Hankey. Can he make the play? Kyle Hankey with the play! He finds a way week in, week out to make the score. Kyle Stanky Hankey. Sole score. Take the third half. 14-13 with 2 seconds left.
Welcome back. 12 teams entered the playoffs. 8 teams remain. We are done with the first round after another thrilling weekend in the AUDL. The LA Aviators got to take the headline from the weekend with their big upset win in Colorado on Saturday night. Austin also getting their first ever franchise playoff victory over Carolina, the 2021 champions. The Soul impressing on defense, converting 8 of 9 break opportunities on the game. DC and Indy taking care of business at home in their respective matchups. Hi everyone, I'm Adam Ruffner, that's Daniel Cohen. We are thrilled to be here with you after another big weekend in the AUDL, the playoffs. Once again, living up to the hype across all 4 divisions. We are looking forward to really getting into, though, the West Division game. Obviously, that one held most people's attention on Saturday night for all the fireworks elsewhere. The Aviators coming away with a big win against the Summit. The Summit had a 12-9 lead at the end of the first half, but the Aviators, behind some impressive Pavel Giannis QB1 action in the second half, as well as a bunch of great defensive playmaking from the Aviators defense, came away with their first playoff win since 2018. Aviators now advancing to face Salt Lake Shred in the West Division Championship in 2 weeks. Daniel, what was your takeaway from Saturday night's win for the Aviators? Was it the star-led attack of Sean McDougall scoring 7 goals? Pavel Giannis finishing with, I think, his most impressive performance as an Aviator, that offense, playmaking down the stretch? Was it the defense, or was it possibly a little bit of a collapse from the home team and a Summit team that we expected to not only be a championship weekend, but possibly contending with the DCs and New Yorks for one of the best teams in this whole dang league? And now they're out of the season before the calendar even flips to August.
Yeah, you can't take anything away from LA for pulling out that win. For me, the big takeaway with LA was just the energy that they showed throughout the game, carrying it over from the way they ended their regular season in that game against Oakland. And I just think, like, in terms of overall team energy, LA isn't one of the teams we've been like applauding in the West for having that as a key part of their identity, right? Like, we talk about Oakland, we talk about Salt Lake and how they can like really go on runs and really seize kind of the overall feel of the game. And that was LA really from the start. Like, they just out-playmade Colorado from start to finish. They closed out the game in the fourth quarter. All that said, though, yeah, it was a collapse from Colorado. Colorado just played a terrible game when they couldn't afford to play a terrible game. There were really bad turnovers on both sides of the disc, both from Colorado and LA. It's hard to take away like a lot of confidence in either team from this game going into the game against Salt Lake. So like, I don't have a lot of confidence in LA despite the way that they played. I just felt like that it was like a sloppy playoff game that LA did seize when it mattered most. And I think if you do take something away from the game, it is that, like, you know, Pavel playing his heart out in the fourth quarter and just willing LA to convert every single possession that mattered. But yeah, at the same time, you look at the 20 plus turnovers from both teams and it's just hard to get so excited about LA going to Salt Lake for the West Division Championship game.
The other 3 winners on the weekend, the highest turnover total among them was Austin with 14. Indy had 12. DC had 10, to kind of give you a scope of where the West was this past weekend. I mean, LA converted at a lower threshold than Colorado on offense. They converted the same number of breaks on defense. LA was a little bit more efficient, but LA was also just 13 of 19 in the red zone against the Summit, just 68% in the final 20 yards of the field. To your point of LA not looking the most efficient playoff team of the bunch, but to your other point, the most energetic. I mean, the Lucas Ambar greatest, the Kevin Tien block, who might be one of the most undersold midseason additions this entire year. You know, they pick him up off of the trash heap that the Spiders left him on. And he comes out and gets 3 playoff blocks in a playoff game, has that big one early on Sanford Brown in the end zone. He just looks so impressive as a big defender to slot in alongside Mitchell Steiner and Calvin Brown, who are really emerging as team leaders on that D-line counterattack. I was just really impressed with Aviators' ability to kind of like find an identity. You know, you talk about this team.
Yeah.
LA was 1-3. Like, we were lamenting them at that point, as far as like it looked like Pavel and whoever he could kind of Velcro to the side of him to come into the backfield and do handler weaves with him. But it was it was kind of a disconnected bunch of misfits at that point. I mean, LA has always kind of been this transitory city and ultimate who has waves of talent come through, but it's really hard to kind of coalesce into a central team culture. And, you know, we talked ad nauseum this offseason about what Pavlianis might bring to LA, what Sean McDougal's return would bring. Obviously, their talent and skills were on full display this weekend, but I think to what we're kind of talking about here, it's that mojo effect too. It's that culture. It's that buy-in. You could see both of those team leaders taking over at points. McDougal in the first half with some of his playmaking, and to your point, Pavlianis in maybe the most impressive half of Ultimate he's ever played in this league as the AUDL's all-time leader in assists and completions. I mean, he was just unrelenting in the third and fourth quarters as far as just punching in drives. Again, they weren't always the easiest of conversions. There were a lot of dirty holds in there for LA, but they got it done. And you could see them doing it with a kind of joy that was just completely absent from the Colorado sideline. There was a nervousness to Colorado kind of that whole game, even when they went up 3 towards the end of the second quarter. And I want to kind of talk about that sequence when Colorado had the disc with a chance to go up 4 with under 3 minutes to play in the half. They had a timeout, and they come away with not only the lack of a break, LA retakes the disc, they go down to the opposite side of the field. Lucas Ambrose gets a buzzer beater, and Colorado finishes the half, giving up a score, not getting a score themselves, and then LA gets the disc to receive in to start the third quarter and gets a dirty hold of their own. And suddenly this goes from possibly Colorado cushioning a 4-goal lead and closing this game out in the second half to Aviators continuing to feed off of their playmaking, their energy, and that central team identity that this franchise hasn't really had in several years, probably since at least 2019 when they last made the playoffs, but even more likely 2018 when they made championship weekend behind McDougal, Mazer, and kind of that more veteran Aviators core. It feels like the return of those players not only, again, has their playmaking obviously been evident in the Aviators' successes, but it's that X factor. It's that stuff we can't look at data tables for. The veterans of Giannis and McDougal really add to LA. And it was just, I don't know, it was stark to see because we talked so much about Colorado's playmaking, and it was there at times. You know, Quentin Finer had a deep cut. Alex Atkins had a big sky in the first half, tried to get the crowd animated as he always does. But it was fleeting, right? Like these were bottle rockets. This wasn't a real fireworks show from Colorado like we saw in 2022. And we've seen at times in 2023, but you know, this is Colorado's now 5th loss of the season. And I think it really marks what's been wrong with this team. And it's that lack of identity. It's that lack of culture. It's that lack of Jonathan Nethercutt, who did not play in this game, was not active for the Summit. A lot of questions around what's happening there. And you can just see it's more questions than answers for a Colorado team that still remains probably one of the 5 most talented rosters in this whole dang league, but just can't quite get it together for more than a quarter or 2 at a time. And even a team like the Aviators, who are not a team who's put together a 4-quarter game yet this year, can take advantage of that. And that's not a position I think either one of us expected the Summit to be in. You know, maybe we expected the West to challenge them more this season. I think we talked a bunch about that, but to watch them just sort of succumb at home to another team that's got this central engine of star power, like that was Colorado's thing in their first season in the West. That's kind of been their identity. They brought in more talent this year, and it's not coalescing. I think they're just such an interesting team, and I think we're going to have a lot to talk about in the offseason, because what kind of went on here? Do you have any ideas? I mean, obviously, I think the biggest one we can address is Nethercutt and the way in which his absences kind of reflect the inconsistencies and some of the mistakes that we saw in Colorado's offense. But I think it goes beyond that. I think that there's a lot of things that kind of unearth here.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, like we kind of talked all year about this lack of identity that Colorado had offensively, like once they started switching Nethercutt over to defense, and just like the fact that Nethercutt missed half the games, we just never really knew what we were getting with Colorado's offense. And yeah, it kind of all came together in a bad way in this playoff game where you just saw the chemistry never looked good for more than like a couple possessions at a time. And that's why even the statement plays by Colorado, like the Big Atkins guy and the Finers guy, it just was never enough because they'd follow it up with just like a very early possession turnover on the next possession. So like there was never an opportunity to really build within that offense. I think there is a world in which they really thrive post Nethercutt if they do move on from him in that offense, or if he moves on from a team or whatever. Because I think they like the general hybrid approach that they have. Like they have a lot of speed on the line. They talk about not wanting to have a QB1 because I think it can make the offense a little bit more stagnant at times. They like kind of getting in motion, getting in rhythm, and just kind of having a more unpredictable spread approach. And like on paper, it's fine and good, but like when you don't have any chemistry building throughout the course of the season, like they just plug in Danny Landisman, Calvin Stoughton, and kind of hope for the best. And it just wasn't great. And like it can look great. I just don't think it's not a recipe for success when those guys aren't playing more than a few games per season.
Yeah. I mean, it's remarkable. Again, like the talent is there. You talk about a quartet of Finer, Stoughton, Atkins, and Landisman as like the young guys on which you can build off of on this team, and then add in veterans like Jay Fruit and Matt Jackson. You go, holy crap, really that's nice top six offense immediately. And yet they struggled throughout the entire second half against this Aviators team that, to LA's credit, brought a whole bunch of pressure. You know, the one statistic that LA dominated in this game was takeaways, and they got a couple on offense. Everett Shapiro got a couple of big clutch interceptions in transition, particularly one in the end zone that led to a leak out score for Aviator Dirty Hold on offense. But defensively, I mean, we mentioned it before, Kevin Tien had an amazing night. Mitchell Steiner had a couple of blocks in space. Who else but Lucas Ambrose I think he actually didn't finish with a block, but obviously finished with the bigger plays of the game, the greatest to sky sequence in the first half that was just kind of roiling the whole Aviators experience into this like electric factory, right?
How is it so inevitable when any disc is floating in the air that Ambrose is going to be the guy that comes down with it? How tall is he? 5'10" or something? Like
not 5'10". All due respect, Lucas, not 5'10". Maybe in some platform shoes. I think more like 5'8", 5'7". I think I've seen listed, but yeah, I mean, he's
no one times it better than him.
It was really wild to go and watch the video because you can go frame by frame and watch him processing the play as if he's going frame by frame. And then you have to remind yourself, that's live action. That disc is like, first off, that throw is one of the worst throws of the entire season. It went 40 yards siloed upwards and then started sailing like a comet towards the sideline. Like the fact that Ambrose even parked underneath of it is a bit of a miracle itself. But then like the way he watches it, like you can see he's almost like processing stuff in flash speed where it's like everyone else is kind of doing things, but he's like watching the disc come in, looking over his shoulder, like sniping out the general vicinity. I mean, it wasn't Kyle Henke flying through the air and like lacing a huck into space, but Ambrose spotted where he could put that disc back into play and I think chose the best angle. And it's just like the fact that you can see him like working through those steps in slow motion on the clip. I mean, it's just, and I think it gets to, it's it's again a display of not only Ambrose's amazing individual talent. I think he basically locks up Rookie of the Year award at the very least with that performance. But
Yeah.
in addition to that, the way in which again this leadership has really stepped up in the second half for LA and built this culture where you can have the TNs, the Ambroses, the Everest Shapiros, these kind of complementary role players, the dudes we didn't necessarily expect to be talking about at the beginning of the season, really elevating into star performers for this playoff team as they make a West Division championship appearance. I think it's always representative when you have the kind of 5, 6, 7 guys on a line excelling at this level, what the others are doing to set them up into that position. When you see, again, like a Shapiro just again and again getting that strike cut call with Pavel in the red zone in the second half, and them having that chemistry, like it wasn't McDougal closing out necessarily for them this time. It was someone else. Another performer who deserves a shout out, Marcel Osborne, especially as a distributor. He was bombing it into space. I mean, he had that kind of hanger that Shapiro bailed them out on with that huge sky over Sanford Brown in the first half, but Osborne's been playing great of late. He had the game-winning score the week prior in in Santa Barbara. He just, again, it's kind of another player each week steps up for LA and has a really good game. Sam Cook had a really good game in Colorado. I think he finished without any turnovers on the night, just kind of being that.
Keough too. Keough also was turnover free.
Yeah, it's like each player has an understanding of who can kind of excel in their given matchups. And that's, again, just such a testament to, I think, the leadership, the coaching staff, kind of the front office, if you will, the game planning of the Aviators. They've gotten to this level after, again, where they looked 4 games into the series, where they looked even at the end of May. Like, this is a pretty radical 7-8 week transformation for LA. I wonder how they'll do against Salt Lake in the West Division Championship game, given the turnovers and mistakes that they were just making in Colorado. So we'll wait and see there. But, this is a successful season. We wondered what the effect would be of bringing in a player like Pavel Giannis. We've never seen a player like that of his caliber really switch franchises at the peak of his career. And this is the effect. And, you see what happened with Chicago and Indy, and it's hard not to reflect on LA kind of got the Dragon Ball star power, and the Union had it usurped from them. And it's kind of a zero-sum game with some of these players at certain points where they really do make an impactful difference on what happens with your teams in these kind of pressure cooker playoff environments.
I think Pavel and Cody Spicer is probably my favorite one-on-one matchup to watch in the entire league. Right? I felt that way in the first week or second week of the season when we saw Colorado come to LA for that first game of the week, and obviously that one was more on display because it was the disjointed LA offense where it was just dominator sets and it was just Spicer chasing Giannis around. But yeah, to close out this game, with how physical both those guys are and how insistent they are in either taking away the space or taking the space in the handler sets, it's just always so fun to watch. And the fact that Pavel just kind of bullied his way forward and willed all of those O-line conversions late in the game, it was a reminder of who Pavel is and why he has the legacy that he does.
Yeah. I mean, 2 traits we don't talk enough about with him is endurance and strength. He gets to spots on command, especially late in game. He has a little bit of a fatigued defender. He will just bully them around in small spaces. And he did it against the reigning defensive player of the year down the stretch. If you go back and you watch that tape, it's Giannis beating Spicer up line a number of times. And I totally agree with you. It's one of the most intriguing matchups because it's kind of 2 counter punchers going at each other. Spicer is a defender and Pavel is a thrower. I think both are very responsive star players. They don't necessarily just beat you with a straight punch right out of the gate. They're not super powerful as a kind of aesthetic. But over the course of game, the way that they can just read, redevelop, adapt to their environment, and by the third and fourth quarters, sort of figure out their matchups and know where they can attack from, it's just so pleasing to watch where they evolve. Because to your point, there was a lot of that kind of reset space jockeying, and then Pavel late in the game taking a lot of leak out cuts and kind of engaging in the fast break and becoming a little bit more of a receiver downfield. and challenging, I think, Spicer's understanding of the roadmap, kind of how far, how much gas Pavel would use on a specific drive. And it just, you could see then Spicer trying to adapt to that. And then Pavel kind of recondensed his game into the red zone, and he's beating him on all these shortcuts. It's just, it's punch, repunch, counter. Like by the time you're in this fourth quarter environment, it's just like they're responding to each other's feints and stuff because they've been setting it up all game with each other. Like it's just like third, fourth, fifth level chess with some of these players, and it's a thrill to watch every week.
And but it's at like peak level exhaustion too. Like both those guys have to be absolutely gassed playing against the other for like multiple points in a row, right? So it's just like it's a battle of who can just like outlast the other in a lot of ways.
You know, it really gave away how gassed Pavel was. He wasn't slightly ridiculous in the post game. He was just like,
oh yeah. I'm sure he was
like, just analyzing, like being complimentary of teammates in the D line. Like if Pavel's not in kind of a clowny mood, that's when you know he's got to go and ice those legs or something. I mean, he's 30 now, right? I think he's in his 30s. So
yeah, I think he's maybe turning 30 pretty soon.
Speaking of, this is a perfect time. Happy birthday to you. It's Daniel's birthday. Yeah. So everyone, if you see this, be sure to wish him well. Maybe send him some Venmo money, a beer, I don't know, flowers if you have his address. If you have his address and you're one of our fans, don't. That would be weird. That would be too far. We love you all. It's been great.
Yeah.
A couple of years.
Just a happy birthday message. Appreciated.
Yeah, maybe don't know our addresses. But
yeah, just comment happy birthday is cool. Thank you.
But again, hats off to LA, hats off to Daniel. Let's move on to the South first round game between Austin and Carolina. Austin coming away with a 19-18 win. Thanks again to their uber efficient D-line break train. 8 of 9 on defensive opportunities in this matchup and just 14 turnovers. They also double up Carolina and Huck completions. Austin owned the deep space in this game. It felt like Jacob Fairfax got free a couple of times. Joe White got free a couple of times, but those felt more like blown coverage sorts of drives for the Carolina offense. The Soul defense, once again this season, I think for like the 8th or 9th time, out converting the offense. The Soul offense certainly had its statement plays. The absolutely bananas Kyle Henke flying buzzer beater to end the third quarter. Evan Swiatek had a good game. Joey Wiley switching over to offense and having over 300 yards of production. He looked amazing as kind of that cleaner piece on their offense and just giving them another dynamic thrower-cutter combo. This is the game that we've been waiting for the Soul to play all season, right? Like, they finally got up for one. It wasn't the most efficient, but 14 turnovers is still darn good.
Pretty good.
Their defense led the way. That is the identity for this team. And on offense, they got enough spark plug plays to say, hey, we're playing at home. We're playing in front of our fans. If you want to trade out with us, you got to kind of meet us on our eye level. I wonder a bit how this game would have gone had Carolina hosted instead, because it felt like a game kind of contingent and swinging on some of the home momentum that Austin had built. But at the same time, Soul got it done. You know, they have 9, they now have 10 wins this season, but their 9 preceding ones were against teams with losing records. So it's just been a giant question mark as to what to expect from an Austin team that clearly has tons of talent, but had been performing a little bit underneath of where we expected them to be. But now with this win, heading into a South Division matchup against a 10-2 Atlanta team who owns the season series against the Soul, do you think Austin has a chance to kind of become a dark horse contender for a championship this year? This is something that we came into 2023 wondering about, given where they performed last year in the playoffs, given how well they challenged the Flyers last year. Now they have their first playoff win. This is a team that we've seen before, most notably last season, really take that fire and run with it because they are such a young team, really moving into the prime years of their playing experience. Like, I'm all of a sudden kind of buying a lot of stock in Austin. Like, I don't know how far to go, but it's going to be a fun one to the moon if it does.
Yeah, I mean, we like teams that peak at the right time, right? And so this 14 turnover game was their lowest mark of the season when they needed it the most, right? And I think from like a pure energy perspective and just the visual of watching the game and kind of feeling how each team was handling things, Austin just looked way more explosive. Carolina I don't want to say they came out flat, but maybe it was like the late scratch of Alex Davis. They just didn't have some of those like big playmaking, like field stretching plays that I feel like the Carolina offense normally has. They were only 5 of 9 on Hucks, and a couple of those came very late. Like they had, I don't know, their second to last possession, Solianic just bombed it to Joe White, and he made a great play. And it was also just kind of like the offense, where we saw Joe White absolutely taking over in that huge win they had against DC. This time it was like they came out with Yannick, Elijah Long, and Matt McKnight as kind of a 3-man backfield, and then Joe White was sort of this like complementary cutter floater hybrid type, and there just wasn't like a sense of like, okay, like Joe White, like take over this game. It sort of started to happen, but it was a little too late, whereas like most of the game was just kind of like steady offensive possessions, but also not really any like game-breaking plays. And so you just felt like every single momentous moment happened in Austin's favor. And I think they were able to just kind of seize that and play with enough efficiency to close out that game. I mean, they got the lead, I think, in the second quarter, and I don't think they lost it from then on.
I think you're right. But, I mean, it was a game that traded, and similar to the West Division game,
sure.
I think that, to your point, the energy plays mattered. You and I, more than anybody, I think, derive a lot of our opinions and thoughts from looking at the data, looking at these box scores, kind of trying to figure out some special magic between numbers and what we see. And I feel like both of these 1-goal wins in the West and the South kind of show you that, yes, execution absolutely matters. Like, Austin won the turnover battle, LA, outperformed in their defensive execution, et cetera, et cetera. But the momentum plays do too. The energy that we keep referring to does really matter in these playoff team matchups where the talent level is basically the same. Like, it does matter if you come out a little bit flat. It does kind of matter if by the third quarter you really haven't had that spark moment, big play that has everyone running off the sideline, whooping and hollering. That really adds up in the playoffs. Maybe not as much in the regular season where you can kind of get by a little bit in some of those late June, early July malaise games at times. But right now in these games, it really matters. And I feel like the same thing happened in the other two matchups where DC and Indy were kind of the only teams out there really making big plays, and their opponents just did not have enough juice to really stay on the field with them for much of those matchups. And I think Carolina, to their credit, they've been juggling 10 different offensive rotations in 13 games this season. Yeah. They did a phenomenal job with, again, a late scratch to AD, who had 50-plus goals last season, was one of the leading receivers in the entire AUDL.
He scored 8, I think, in their last game when they went
he was on.
It was him in that game.
Yeah, it was a 2-goal win at Austin, and it was because of Alex Davis just owning the deep space. He was just running vertical routes on the soul all day, and Austin didn't do anything to stop him. And you could just see when Carolina doesn't have the backfield anchored by Gucho Hannes, and they're lacking a couple of their deep targets, and they can't do that balance of the backfield nucleus churning atom of production, and then the downfield stretching of Fairfax, Joe White, Terrence Mitchell, or AD, or Jungsteven at times. Like, when they don't have the kind of small and big to telescope between, they get weird. They get stuck in that no man's land where they obviously had a bunch of really effective red zone possessions. I was super impressed with how the Flyers produced when they did get into scoring range. I mean, Jungs was just owning the front cone as he's been known to do. But they sort of had trouble getting there at times. Like, it felt like they didn't have a reliable way to kind of fast track into the red zone and then weave and get a score in. It was either kind of taking shots long from deep and having a lot of them stall out and having Austin help defenders get underneath the disc and cause turnovers, or it felt like them having to quickly move into red zone possession and possibly make a mistake or two, as we saw the Flyers make. There was just a couple of bad drops. Again, issues with just not playing as that particular unit all season. I think that was the first time we'd ever seen those 7 players line up and play offense together for the Flyers. And it's just, again, like, eminently talented team, much like Colorado. You can't just plug and play on offense right now, especially against playoff competition and especially against, I think, a team as athletic as Austin, who can generate a lot of pressure on their own. They're going to get into that lane a little bit quicker if you don't have that absolutely seamless swing pass coming off. If you don't have that Gucho Hannes turn pivot, no thoughts up here, like you can just see a little bit more hesitation in Carolina, and that gives Austin and its defenders that much more of a step, and that's the game.
Yeah, I think what was interesting too is we probably didn't talk enough about like Carolina's D-line offense this season, but I think the fact that they haven't had either Elijah Long nor Eric Taylor quarterbacking that line, whereas the past few seasons, or Seth Weaver, like they've kind of had what we've thought of as one of the better D-line counterattacks over the past few seasons, but this year, because of the absences and inconsistencies on offense, they've had to shift some of those guys over. And the D-line only converted 50% against Austin. When we compare it to what Austin was able to do, you can also point to that as a reason why they couldn't quite keep up. And I think just the lack of personnel on both sides have really added up for Carolina this year. It is interesting, like the path both them and Colorado had this season, where like you can never really count out either of those teams given the talent we know that they have and given the depth. But it clearly didn't click enough in the playoffs for either of those teams. And so I think the more deserving team won both of those matchups.
Yeah. I mean, across all 4 games, it really felt like the team that had, entered this playoff matchup with the most cohesiveness, identity, execution, strategy.
Yeah.
There were no real momentum. Yeah, there were no real, I guess, overall surprises. Like, I do think that Austin and LA are formally upsets as far as we construct
they were
them.
Underdogs.
But at the same time, like, you watch those games, and it wasn't like by the fourth quarter I was clawing at my face going, oh my gosh, how can Colorado be? It's like, LA's got 2 of the best scorers ever on offense, and their defense is elevated and playing at an increasingly better level every week. Like, I think that is also another story that we haven't talked enough about. It's LA's defense developing over the course of the season. We kind of said going in with the additions of McDougal and Pavel that their offense would assuredly get to a state of competency pretty quick. But on defense, it was kind of like, okay, how are all these pieces going to fit together? So much of this D-line hasn't really played in these formations. Another name that we didn't mention who also had a great night in Colorado was the former Summit player himself, Daniel Brunker. Had a big huck in the first half.
That one huck he had to Tien, that was one of my favorite throws of the game, probably.
He's had a couple this year. I know he's only been active in like 5 games, but Brunker can bring it, man. Like, really underrated addition. I know that McDougal and Giannis get all of the hype, but again, you talk about rookie Ambrose, the Kevin Tien midseason addition, the Daniel Brunker pickup. I mean, this team didn't even have Jason Valley yet, who is maybe the 3rd most hyped member of their offseason kind of additions. And I don't know, like, it seems like LA is really just beginning their takeoff and ascent right now, and they have so much more space to work into and to develop. I mean, they just knocked off Colorado, and they did not play anywhere close to their best game. So that's something to also pay attention to with them. I think we were deriding them a bit for some of their performance metrics and how they emerged from the Summit in Colorado and their home field experience. But, the Aviators also have just all this room for growth. So it'll be interesting to see if they can maybe continue to tap into that as their competition level rises, with probably the second steepest test of the championship round. And that's going to face the Shred in Salt Lake. The Shred have looked like the second best team all year. And this will be a true test for what is the possible ceiling, what is the kind of flight limit for this Aviators team, so to speak. But let's just touch on a little bit the games in the East and the Central. I know they weren't necessarily the most competitive matches. I know you and I were chatting on Saturday night being like, really hope the latter 2 games don't necessarily.
Such a bad start to the playoffs. Just not interesting.
Let's be honest, Chicago, I think, turned the disc over on their second throw of the game. This offense is completely reformatted in the last 2 weeks of the season. So the Union showing that they are still just struggling to form an identity. And the AlleyCats, as they've done all season long, were super efficient on both offense and defense. They converted 70% of their offensive possessions and 53% of their defensive possessions, getting 9 breaks on the game. They almost had as many blocks as turnovers. They had just 12 turnovers and 11 takeaways. Will Quigley and Will Wettengale both looked amazing, the 2 teenage rookies for the AlleyCats. That bodes really well, as the AlleyCats move forward to their Central Division Championship game against Minnesota. But this Chicago team is in such dire straits right now that it sort of felt like it was a nice win for Indy, but their true test is still coming up in 2 weeks. And then in DC, Boston has looked so good all year, and it felt like they threw out one of their newer lineups on both offense and defense against a DC team that is starting to peak. I mean, DC did not allow a break in this game. They were 13 of 14 on overall holds, and I think the only one that they missed was on a buzzer beater. So, I think they tried a buzzer beater. I would need to go back and look. Anyways, DC is playing some of its most efficient ball all season. Boston looked like it had taken a couple steps back. It looked like they were trying to adapt to some new lineup additions and just lost a little bit of the chemistry and fluidity that we've been seeing from Glory's attack and offense in particular the past several weeks. So tough way for Boston to end this season after they did make their first playoff appearance, and tough for the Union as well, as they go from being the runner-up finishers last year to a first-round exit this year, and a lot of question marks heading forward. But what were your kind of thoughts from Central and East Division? And I guess maybe more importantly, how does this set up for what we expected to be the matchups in the divisional championship round for both of these divisions?
Yeah, I mean, both wins were definitely nice confidence builders, and the fact that they got these wins with such low turnover numbers, like that's such a nice way to go in to the next round of the playoffs. DC in particular, their last 4 games, 9 turnovers, 15 turnovers, 8 turnovers, and then 10 turnovers this past weekend. Like they are playing their best ultimate right now. And so I think that really we could not ask for a better version of DC than what we've been seeing recently. And the fact that they played this against a Boston team that was kind of, nipping at their heels for a lot of the later part of the season, going into this game against New York, I just think it's really exciting. The fact that we're getting such efficient ultimate from DC. New York is still the juggernauts that they've always been, but yeah, I'm very much looking forward to that game. And then with Indy, I just think like they kind of needed a good runaway game like this after grinding out a couple of close wins against Pittsburgh to end the season. I think it was nice that they really like put their foot down and were like, okay, yeah, we're the second best team, or we're at least the second best team in this division. We deserve to be in the Central Division Championship, and I think they can take that momentum into Minnesota. It's still a grab bag of what kind of game we get from them, just given what happened the last time we went to Minnesota and they turned the disc over 28 times, something like that. Easily their worst game of the season, and has been an outlier to this point. So the fact that they have some positive momentum going, and the fact that it was never in doubt, their game against Chicago, I think that's a nice way to go into the next round.
Yeah, and I think also, especially with that offense finally at full strength again, they have Xavier Payne, Keegan North, Travis Carpenter all operating in the backfield as throwers, and then just that upfield quartet of Rick Gross, Levi Jacobs, Jeremy Keish, and Cam Brock are about as versatile as a cutting core as you can get. And to see those full 7 really just kind of stepping out there, that whole second half, they were just running. Like they were just kind of playing how they wanted to and spreading the disc. I think that bodes really well for them heading up to face a wind chill team in Minnesota that always wins games there because of their defense. And to your point, they have to limit those 28 turnovers. There were several notable offensive starters absent for that game up a few weeks ago in Minnesota. So hopefully the AlleyCats can just sort of refocus and understand that this will be a completely different matchup. And I think maybe even more impressively than seeing their offense kind of finally reform into its full contingency, I think the defense elevating and kind of putting its foot down on a struggling Chicago team shows that the AlleyCats can take advantage of matchups where they have them. And that's something that wasn't apparent earlier in this year because there's so much youth on this Indy D-line, right? We mentioned the 2 teenagers in Quigley and Wettengale, But, you go down that roster, I think the most experienced member is Nick Hutton, and I think he's still just shy of 30. Most of this roster is 27 and under on defense, and you can see that when they start to get a little bit of confidence, they allow themselves a little bit more playmaking. They started to open it up in the second half, really pressure underthrows. Minnesota's offense has struggled all year, so maybe Indy can finally move some of this momentum defensively after a confident game against a struggling Union team to really push Minnesota home, because Winchell, for all their talent, for all their throwing, they have struggled as much as anyone now still in the playoff field for converting offensive possessions. They, I think, now have the lowest offensive efficiency rating of the 8 remaining teams.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely like a point to exploit if you're Indianapolis, like especially if Indy finds that their own offense is struggling. Like, yeah, it's going to be time for their defense to take charge over a Winchell offense that, yeah, I don't know. I mean, they haven't looked good since week 3, right? They had a few games to start the season where they were converting upper 60% offensive conversion rate, but since then, I mean, yeah, they've also gone through a lot of lineup inconsistency, and we saw what just happened to teams like that in Colorado and Carolina. So I don't know. It sets up a really interesting matchup because, yeah, that Minnesota defense, especially playing at home, has just been a totally different beast from anything else we've seen across the league this season. So, yeah, it's kind of like opposite momentums kind of colliding in 2 weeks. Still got to wait till those division championship games.
Yeah. Which kind of brings us to the end of the episode. I wanted to get to final thoughts, but just to kind of tell our audience about the rest of the playoff picture, there will be a playoff bye week in the first weekend of August coming up. We will also be taking a break this coming Thursday from the Swing Pass Pod. We'll be back the beginning of next week to do 2 pods leading up to Divisional Championship Weekend on August 11th and 12th. We need to go look at the specific divisions that play on each day, but 2 divisions play on Friday, 2 divisions play on Saturday, so there's a little bit more spreading of the matchups to really intake as much playoff AUDL as possible, and all 4 divisional championship games, I think, are going to be 4 of the better games we see all year. I mean, you get DC, New York in the East, you get Indy, Minnesota in the Central, ATX and ATL in the South, and then LA and Salt Lake in the West. There's just storylines everywhere. In the South, I feel like you have the 2 most explosive athletic franchises. In the West, we have the 2 most talked about franchises, I think, of the entire year. In the Central, we have the 2 favorites that we kind of expected to be here at the beginning of the year. And then in the East, we get the granddaddy of them all. We get DC, New York, which has been the determining point for who gets to go to that division in each of the past 2 seasons that the East has been in formation. Of course, in 2021, there was the Atlantic Division. Both DC and New York made the playoffs. Neither of them met that year, but New York has won each of the past 2 East Division title games against DC. Of course, Breeze still looking for their first championship weekend appearance. So this is where I want to ask you, what are kind of your thoughts about this past weekend, and I guess extending into divisional championship weekend? Like, where does your mind go? Because I kind of feel like I'm at this interesting plateau point where I'm both reflecting on, kind of where we are, but it suddenly feels like with this break, like there will be this second season all of a sudden. Last year, we didn't have this. We didn't have this continuity at any point between the regular season and the playoffs or anything. And so now it kind of feels like we get to step a little bit more thoroughly into these 8 remaining teams left on the AUDL docket and really start to understand them. So I guess, anything really, what are your thoughts on MVP? Where do you see kind of a team like Austin ending up? Is it just kind of New York versus the field at this point? I feel like much of my understanding of the league got a little bit shifted this past weekend. I think I went into this past weekend thinking Jeff Babbitt was going to be the clear MVP. Starting to lean a little bit more Pavel now.
MVP, right? Man, I can't get into it. I haven't processed enough of it because you can't look at Sean McDougal having a 7-goal game either and be like, okay, he's definitely not the MVP. I mean, yeah, he had a few
3 turnovers,
but But
I know
man, like,
he's been phenomenal. I think I called him the team's clear MVP like last Thursday. So
yeah. Also, just like the fact that they are able to slot him over on defense so much, and he's like every time he was out on the D line, I feel like it was him scoring the goals too. It's like you get just that incredible two-way playmaking ability that we don't really see elsewhere besides from Jeff Babbitt. But no, I don't want to get into the MVP conversation just yet. My greater like zoom out kind of goes to, well, one, I think this current slate of central or of divisional championship games, it feels like there's a lot of uncertainty across all these games and like who I actually see coming out on top. I mean, I view the Shred as like the heaviest favorites in any of these matchups, but I could really see any of the other three going either way, which I feel like I don't get a lot just historically going into the
that wasn't the case last year. Last year, the four teams that made the championship weekend had 2 combined losses.
Yeah, it was all the 1 seeds, right? And so, yeah, I don't think I have felt this way, this much uncertainty about the divisional championships this year as I have in past years. But I do want to say, like, to me, the greater narrative and greater conversation always comes back to, like, who is the team that is most likely going to beat New York? And I had the pleasure of going on the Empire radio show last week, and they asked me that question. And it's tough because I think Salt Lake has been the second best team in the entire league throughout the year. And we've talked about the fact that they are the most efficient offensive team this year. And that stat has predicted, I think, all of the last champions except one. Yeah, like 2015 Spiders, or maybe the one exception to that. But otherwise, like the best offensive team typically wins the championship. So I want to say Salt Lake might be able to give New York the best run for their money, but I still think it's DC. I still think DC, just with the familiarity they have with New York, the fact that they play them so much, and the fact that DC is clearly peaking at the right time, I view this game as like it has been hyped for the past several years. Every single year, we're going to talk about DC and New York meeting again in the East Division Championship game, and so again, like every other year, that is the game that I'm really circling on my calendar and could not be more excited about going forward.
I mean, I'm just feeling great that you finally come around, I think, 8 or 9 months later now to the team I picked way back last November.
It took them a while to sway me. They didn't have like a dominant season, there wasn't so much like, okay, this is DC and New York for sure this year, where DC was like definitely in the conversation for second best team throughout last season. I would say it didn't feel like that to me this year. Atlanta's still good. Colorado was still in that conversation for a lot of the year. But at this point, yeah, I mean, you got to respect what they've put together recently.
I guess I just wonder a little bit about that, if that's not more our perceptions of things and kind of Salt Lake emerging as this other superpower taking away a little bit of our attention. I just think that I agree with you. There's been consistency issues that we've had questions about with DC, but their resume pretty much speaks for itself. I mean, 2 of their 3 losses are to New York. 1 was by a single goal in overtime. You flip that result, which very easily could be done had Benyat not gone monster mode with that sky.
But you can't flip those results.
I know. But like
wins those games.
We so routinely judge other teams by how close they come to New York, and I just feel like, for the sake of argument, DC deserves a similar sort of consideration for the fact of, we flip one New York game. Let's just say we flip the overtime game, and they're 10-2, and they're sitting in this position. I don't feel like that's that different, and I don't feel like it's like them winning that game against New York or not doesn't really change how I feel about DC. As much as that kind of doesn't make sense, like, I still think that the Breeze are the Breeze are the Breeze. Like, they perform at this level. Like, they're one of the most consistent performers over the past half decade in this entire league. And so I think that for as close as no cigars it's been, like, this, to your point, is still kind of the team that I keep coming back to, is who can really beat New York. I think it is still, to your point, DC. I mean, I think that the Shred and Atlanta still have some very big arguments to be made. I think Atlanta has learned a bunch from their midseason clash with the Empire. It seems like they are able to kind of carry themselves in a little bit larger capacity than the Hustle have in previous seasons. And we saw what the Shred brought in that home game just a couple weeks ago against the Empire, where they were neck and neck for most of that matchup and continuing to push even as they were starting to fade in the second half. So I think that there's contention to be everywhere. But yeah, I kind of rise at the same point as you do with the Breeze, where it's just they're kind of built like they've been constructed in a specific response to this Empire, right? Like that's been their mission. And you could kind of feel it as they were starting to close out Boston. There is a couple of get off me plays from DC. I remember Tyler Monroe in particular taking some.
Tyler Monroe was barking after that one.
I mean, time on just gets like that. It doesn't necessarily take a whole bunch, but when he's like that, when he gets into that mode, it just makes them a different team. Like he is such a playmaking leader in that capacity, and when he starts to get that chip on his shoulder, and DC starts to run downhill in those red zone sets on you, like they feel like a competitor on the caliber of New York, where it's just they've got an edge, man. They're not only talented as hell, they've got this thing of you can't run with me on this point. Like Boxley was doing some shadow boxing moves to Boston defenders in the second half when they would try to spy on a thrower. He was just putting people in the forgotten realm a couple of times for goals. And it's just that. It's that little bit of extra that DC has to have. The way that they've closed out games in the fourth quarter too. I think not only their close finishes, obviously against Carolina and New York, but they have that just kind of foot down ability that New York has, that Atlanta has, that I think we associate with championship contenders. So. Anyways.
For sure. No, and I think that's been a big growth point for DC, and it just has changed the way I look at them, because I think the idea of closing out of the game in the fourth quarter has become so apparent as a quality of those elite teams that it's been New York's calling card. And I think that's why you talk about if one of those results was flipped this year, and DC was the one that closed out a game against New York. Yes, that to me, I think that does carry a lot more weight. I guess you were saying the opposite, that that doesn't change your perception of DC much. Maybe it would change my perception more of New York. I would say that would show me that New York is human and that they're susceptible to losing a game like that, but we haven't seen them do that in a long time.
Thanks once again for actually making my point sound more coherent, because that's kind of what I was getting at. It's DC is there. The fact that they haven't beaten New York yet, I don't think is necessarily a total quality of the Breeze. I think it's more of a quality of the Empire continuing to make these ridiculous end of game highlight plays. We keep talking about, what are you going to do when New York or Beignet turns into the Statue of Liberty? Put the jet puff marshmallow man on him. I don't know. Yeah, but that's not an indicator of DC. It's more of an indicator of New York. Anyways, I'm gonna muddle this up with more words. I just wanted to say that you put it much better. But
great.
That should do it for this episode of Swing Pass. We will be taking a break this Thursday, as there will be no games to preview in the upcoming weekend, but we will return next week with some very tantalizing divisional championship preview content. We will be tuning in for the 7 remaining games on the AUDL calendar, just 4 divisional championship games in each of the divisions, and then of course championship weekend, 2 semifinals games, and the championship on August 25th and 26th in Minnesota. We cannot wait for these last few weeks to watch alongside you. They should be some of the best games of 2023, if not the best. We can't wait. We bet you can't either. We'll talk to you soon. Bye now.